Right, okay. Então, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll speak English because that's what Sónia asked me to do. And so on behalf of ICS, Institute of Social Sciences, I'd like to welcome you all to today's meeting. Immigration and Vulnerable Populations, one of the 4 workshops organized by the project SustainLis, and a 3-year project, if I understand correctly, supported by FCT, the Portuguese funding agency, and which brings together, as we can see, researchers from 2 important centres, ICS and IGOT, the Institute of Geography and Spatial Planning. And so I'd like to begin with a special word of greetings and thanks to the keynote speakers and discussants. Jorge isn't here yet, but Andreas Hendricks from the University of the Federal Armed Forces, Munich, is that how we reply? And Marta, Rodrigues, Neves, University of Southern Denmark, and Jennifer McGarrigle. How do you pronounce her name? McGarrigle, thank you. Also McGarrigle, also from IGOT, and I understand that she's almost a binational by now, after being here for 16 years. Right? So I would also like to thank and congratulate the coordinator of SustainLis, Sónia Alves, and of course the whole research team, not only for taking on the challenge of bringing together researchers from different countries and disciplines, but also for taking on this huge challenge of providing a deeper understanding of the complex problem, the effects of housing and urban requalification on vulnerable populations, but with a very specific aim to provide practical knowledge that will inform innovative and locality-sensitive policy responses. So policy responses that will really seek to reduce inequalities and provide healthier living conditions and also social inclusion. And of course this is I imagine, your main challenge. Just 2 very brief comments. First, I always think it's important to remind ourselves that cooperation and networking with other researchers, with different social actors, are crucial to science and research for several reasons, but mainly due to the fact, and we know that really due to the pandemic even more, sharing... Oh, here's Jorge. Hi, Jorge. Over here. So I was saying that cooperation is essential because sharing and social interaction are really fundamental drivers of ideas, creative thinking, collaborative writing, and the building up of relevant policy recommendations. So, in fact, collaborative and multidisciplinary projects are a unique opportunity to incentivize groundbreaking research and evidence-based policy making, and also systematic dialogue with relevant stakeholders. And as social scientists, we all know that these aspects of research, time and resources for research and for systematic collaboration which boosts research, are becoming more difficult to achieve. The social sciences, I think in particular, are being hard hit by changing attitudes to science and knowledge production. The tendency to value applied research rather than a healthy balance, as you have in your project, between fundamental and applied research. And also another tendency, which is to consider the social sciences as secondary in the global order of knowledge production. And this hasn't changed. In fact, I think it has worsened. And, for example, as a result of these trends, the social sciences have continued to lose their foothold in major European programs. And Horizon Europe, which by comparison with Horizon 2020 reduces still further the presence of the social sciences, is a case in point. But also the national recovery and resilience plans, actually, the PRR, and the ones that the European Union have been negotiating in response to the pandemic crisis, are also in many cases another example of this. In spite of the recognition of science in dealing with the pandemic crisis and with responding to it, it is mainly the hard sciences that are incentivized in these plans. And this is strange, especially when European societies and governments recognize that the pandemic and other crises such as the war now are revealing crucial societal challenges, increasing vulnerabilities in housing and living conditions, increasing inequalities, increased barriers to democracy, to global solidarity, and new flows of migrants. So I would like to take this opportunity to ask you all in the context of the analysis you'll be carrying out on vulnerable populations, to also reflect on what these trends in science may mean for urban policies and the future of well-being in European cities. My second comment is related to the topic of today's meeting, immigration and vulnerable populations, and to the focus on historic city centres which the project has adopted. I am biased because I live in the historic city centre of Lisbon, and I have witnessed over the last 3 years a huge change. So just some straightforward questions or thoughts related to this, and so please forgive me if they are very simplistic, coming from a sociologist that has never worked on in the field of urban studies. A first question is related to the effects of touristification and financialization, which will be addressed by Jorge today. Before the pandemic, but increasingly over the last 2 years, developments were already pointing to the overwhelming effects of touristification and financialization, and also the effects of new legislation related to requalification on Lisbon's historic city centre. And these are trends which not only segregate, but they have also dramatically expelled the more vulnerable populations, in particular immigrants and the elderly. I know, as we were talking a while ago, that Moradia still has immigrants actually living there, but the change over the last 5 years in terms of the expulsion of local populations has dramatically changed what we used to have in that area. For example, Moradia, which was a sort of community, or a mix, middle class and low class and immigrants, but it was a kind of community, and this has changed. And I think, as we all know, but you know better than I do, most migrant families live outside the city centre, mostly on the outskirts, and even in new shanty towns. I was looking, I think there are about 13 or 14 still, and they've grown up again in certain areas of Greater Lisbon. So my first question, which I would like to put on the table, is related to the focus you have on the historic city centre. With increasing segregation and housing problems for immigrants, should SustainLis not be comparing the historic centre with other parts of the city of Lisbon, where the majority of migrant families live, or where there might be more hope, or still some hope, for them to continue to lead better lives? But maybe I'm being very pessimistic from what I have seen happening in the Moradia area. So, in other words, to compare in parts of the city where specific housing, social inclusion, and requalification policies could still have a major impact. A second query is related to the challenge of the current crisis with new migration and refugee flows, and the fact that some of the barriers to migration and circulation across borders introduced during the pandemic, they're receding. And so my question is, will this put more pressure on segregation and the expulsion of vulnerable populations, or have the consequences of the pandemic and the current crisis raised a new political awareness regarding the need for new housing and social inclusion policies in historic city centres? Can we detect changes on this score? There may be a new political awareness that will make a difference, and make a change now to what has happened over the last 5 years. Can we detect changes? And so our historic centres, can they be seen now as a sort of gateway for shifting towards more sustainable futures for vulnerable populations, or is there no hope? And of course, just to conclude, 3 main wishes. First of all, I wish you a productive and inspiring meeting. And secondly, I would like to wish you all the best in maintaining and strengthening your ties and all the ongoing collaboration which you have managed to build up. And lastly, I hope that the project will lead to innovative and impactful recommendations, since it's one of its major goals. So thank you very much, and have a good debate, and thank you once again. Sonia, do you want me to hand over to Jorge now?
I think so.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction, because I think we already have a series of really good discussion questions to get the debate started at the end. So first of all, I'd like to start by saying good afternoon to Professor Karin Wall, the Director of ICS, also to Dr. Sónia Alves, the Coordinator for SustainLis. It's the reason why we're all here. Also, good afternoon to our illustrious speakers and the whole research team as well. And last but not least, the audience. So, and thanks again, George and Sonia, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations and debating some of these questions. And it's so nice to be here presentially without, hybridity or Zooms, or just to be in a room and listen and debate. So, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be part of this session this afternoon. I think, as Professor Karin Wall was saying, the SustainLis project places vulnerable populations at the centre of its inquiry, and it's really investigated the impacts of housing and of urban requalification policies on young adults, on seniors, and on immigrants, with this territorial focus on the historic centre of Lisbon. I think sort of a laboratory that really encompasses diverse kinds of social and urban change over its very recent past. So I think it's a really interesting area to ask questions related with inclusion, segregation, and affordable housing. So the project obviously focuses on people, on the one hand to provide empirical evidence on the housing conditions, also trajectories, needs, preferences. So there's a real sort of agency focus aspect to the project, looking at what vulnerable citizens living in the city centre feel about where they live, what their visions are for their housing in the future. But also, on the other hand, there's a real focus, like Professor Karin Wall already said, on applied sort of innovative policy outputs that really tries to promote social transformation and social change. And this is one aspect that I would really sort of like to congratulate the whole research team on so far, because I think that you've had such a strong presence in social media, in communication, in policy forums, that I think that it's a really good example of how research and more applied thinking can come together and create a platform for change. So our session today, as everyone knows from the title, will zoom in on one of the vulnerable groups that are studied in the SustainLis project, that is immigrants. It's a really important question. It's a group that tends to experience more poverty, more housing cost burden, and overcrowding due to different sort of social and financial barriers that they face to access decent housing. And I think that this is, an increasingly complexified problem whenever we think about what's happening in terms of diversification, of migration, and new flows. So we're dealing with a really complex social problem here. So I think this is a great opportunity to have some empirical input, and then maybe at the end we can all reflect together and debate this question of immigration and housing and socioeconomic spatial inequalities in the city. So I'm delighted to present our speakers today. First of all, we have Jorge Malheiros from IGOT, also here at the University of Lisbon. We have Andreas Hendricks from the University of Bundeswehr, did I say it well? Munich. and Marta Neves Rodrigues from the University of Southern Denmark. So each will speak for around 25 minutes, and then we'll have time for open debate at the end. So you can note your questions down, and we'll have a time for questions and discussion at the end. So without sort of further ado, I'll pass the floor over. I'll introduce our first speaker first, and then I'll pass the floor over to him. So our first speaker today is Jorge Malheiros. He's worked extensively in the area of international migration, and specifically on socio-spatial organisation, also on questions related with migrant integration and housing. So he's definitely a reference in the field on urban segregation in Southern Europe. Jorge is Professor of Human Geography in IGOT. He's researcher at the Centre for Geographical Studies, and he's also the co-coordinator of the research group ZOE, which is a group on urban and regional change and policies. Besides this, he's also the member of the editorial board for the Amisco Springer collection on migration. He is also the Portuguese correspondent of SOPME of the OECD, and he's also on the editorial board of numerous other scientific journals, including Finisterre and Movimento Sociais e Dinâmicas Especiais, just to mention a few. So today I think he's going to look back to his past work on urban segregation and reflect on what's changed over the past decade and a half. So Jorge's presentation today is entitled Socio-Ethnic Segregation in a Context of Touristification and Financialization, What's Changed in the Past 15 Years. Jorge, it's over to you.
Sorry,
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Sonia, for organizing this and letting us go here. I mean, most of us know each other quite well, so this is more a conversation than really a presentation. So it's good that we can have more of a discussion than a kind of formal presentation. That sort of format. But I must say that when somebody says research extensively means normally old, that the person is old. It is research extensively because is old. Now, and this is the first time where I feel a bit old, because I decided to, for various reasons, I think I can now spend some time, from now on, not now, from now on, that I will be able to spend some time in some of the issues which I've researched in the past and which I didn't have the time to go back. And this is perhaps the first moment where I do this exercise. It is the beginning of that exercise. So I changed slightly the title, and it is residential segregation now, because it could be the other one, but there is an element of sorry, there was a wrong slide here. I hope that there are no more wrong slides. Yeah. Okay. Something from analysis. So, and the discussion is about socio-spatial segregation. And first, I went to go back to where I started a quarter of a century ago, more or less, when I started to be, or 20 years ago, a little bit more actually, when I started to be interested on segregation issues. And at the time, the reading was very much based on the US experience, still influenced by the Chicago school perspectives. And then there were several scholars in Northern Europe, especially the United Kingdom, but also in other Northern European countries, that were already doing work on segregation. But the most advanced and experienced research was US research. And the key, especially because in the US, it's not an issue so much of immigration, though there was the immigration issue when talking about segregation in the 20s. But the question in the 80s and 90s were very much ethnic segregation associated to race. it was the problem of race, especially the concentration of black or Afro-Americans, to be correct, in certain neighborhoods. That was the key issue of debate in the 80s and 90s, despite the ethnic neighborhoods where Italian immigrants and their descendants live or left the mark because several had moved to other places. And the idea is very much this connection between socio-ethnic stratification and spatial residential hierarchies. So segregation is a product or the spatial mirror, or if we consider our active space, something that shows the interaction between how we organize in social terms and how we organize, or our societies organize in spatial terms. So when we talk about segregation, we have this pattern of differentiation in terms of segregation in perspective of geography. This pattern of spaces which express distinct presences of social groups. But when we talk about segregated spaces, we are not thinking in the overall matrix of the spatial organization that is segregated, but we are thinking in particular spaces which are marginalized from the rest of the city. Marginalized in the sense of having lower contacts, of being in areas which are distant, and in which social challenges or problems have an higher expression. Unemployment, school dropout, eventually criminality, decay of the housing structures. So social vulnerability and exclusion of some groups as an higher presence of these spaces. Or these spaces are characterized or being spaces which have been produced in the sense of concentrating of these populations. I've picked up a sentence which was said by Tom Slater when he was at IGOT a couple of years ago, and it was about South Africa, where we can have the extreme segregation during the apartheid regime. And he picked this sentence from former South African Prime Minister, Vorster, and he said that if I were to wake up one morning and find myself a black man, the only major difference would be geographical. This is just to highlight or to enhance the idea that the spatial expression of inequality and the spatial expression of disadvantage is crucial to understand this disadvantage itself and social disadvantage. We cannot understand social disadvantage if we don't incorporate a spatial element. This is why I picked up this, let us say, a bit extreme sentence here. Now, and these are the extreme examples. They are not from Europe, of course. I mean, not of course. They are not from Europe. Skip, of course. And they show, these are things that you can find at internet, and they show exactly how spaces of very different nature can coexist in some of the bigger metropolis of the planet. This is a classical photo of São Paulo, where Paraisópolis and Morumbi coexist. So it's the extremely wealthy gated communities and higher density informal space where, let us say, low class concentrates. And there is an ethnic dimension, as you would expect, because the ones living in the gated community are whiter and the ones living in the favela are darker. The same happens in Johannesburg, where you have the same pattern. Now, in this case, we don't have verticalized housing structures, so it's detached houses, but it's the same idea of density, presence of greener areas, and of course, the type of populations is very different, both in ethnic and social terms. So this is the scene. And when we look into, I'm sorry, this one is in Portuguese, because I worked out a slide which I've used in the past, and I've added a few more things. So this is a simplified structuralist perspective on socio-spatial segregation, which is a bit inherited from the traditional perspectives coming from the West, and also a little bit from critical geography of Marxist inspiration. So the contemporary segregated city develops and is pushed by the capitalist development. We all know this since the 19th century. And we can assume that there are 4 structural pillars for this process. One is the economic, so it's the rent, land rent, and the decisions of the market and their changes. So let's have an example. We'll go for more pragmatical things in a few minutes. When we think about the expansion of Lisbon, or the metropolitan area of Lisbon, in the 70s and 80s, it was marked by ownership and new homes. So this was the idea. The strategy was expansion of credit, or financialization, or at least one of the elements of financialization. And how was this done in territorial terms? This was done through expansion of the limits of the urban area and scattering of the population. It is the suburban strategy. So the gains were associated to a spreading strategy, with informal components, but with a lot of formal components as well. Now, when we look into the post-crisis period, the gains had to change for several reasons that we can discuss later. But the strategy now is concentrated in rehabilitating the city center. And with the support of a more internationalized capital, selling the new assets to higher classes in this area. This causes on one hand gentrification, and on the other hand, as Karin Wall has remembered us, it causes the eviction of the populations that are living in the city center. So in both cases, the gains are a key engine for the process. And the two processes are very different in terms of what will happen to the city. In one case, it's clearly suburban expansion. In the other case, it's transition and concentration in the city center. So this is one of the elements. The other element is policies. So how do we incorporate the 4th pillar of social state, assuming that there is still social state and assuming that housing is a pillar, but according to the Portuguese constitution, housing is still a fundamental right. And I believe it is a fundamental right in the constitutions of other European countries as well. So if housing is still a right, how is this incorporated in terms of assuming the principle of housing for everybody, in housing with quality and access to housing for everybody? And then there is planning, which is also crucial in this asset. The planning norms in terms of density, for instance, urban density in the various areas, or in the location of the public housing, are 2 examples on how planning also contributes to define the segregation patterns. And finally, because this is more about ethnic segregation, not so much on this discussion, and not so much on social segregation, there is the migration issues. The moment when migrants enter, the profiles of migrants, and also, let us say, the connection of the migrants to the society where they are arriving, are just 3 examples of elements which contribute to higher or lower concentration of migrants and to higher or lower segregation levels. So overall, it is the housing market in the context of capitalism, not just expansion, but capitalism evolution and change, that determines the way how segregation works. Actually, we can have desegregation with increasing in housing inequalities. I'll go back to this in a minute. Now, this is a slide which actually has been inspired by Jennifer, and there are explanations for segregation which try to underline voluntary choice. It is this idea that migrants close together due to, let us say, homophilia processes. This goes back to explanations by the Ballards, for instance, in 1977, and the idea is that because to cluster is not necessarily negative, migrants tend to stay together because, let us say, social capital is valued, especially bonding social capital, protection against the remaining society, contacts, transfer of knowledge, support by the group. And so in this case, what is enhanced is the idea that the groups are together because they choose to be together. The question is why some migrants cluster and others don't. We challenge a little bit this notion, because if this pattern was a generalizable thing, every group would more or less behave the same way. And this is not true. But it has a role. And then there are the structural constraints which go back to the scheme which I've just chosen, which I've just shown you. Now, probably there are three issues that should be assumed here. First, limited choices show combination between structure and agency. On my perspective, and I assume that I'm structurationist, structure has a stronger power than voluntary choice. So it's an asymmetrical combination. It's not just a combination. The second thing is there is an influence of context. The city is not a simple palimpsest where things overlap. But the change in urban structures is slow, unless we have destructions as the ones we have seen in the case of the invasion of Ukraine. But in and even those have there is some resilience, actually. We'll see it in the future. But anyway, so there is a context which, in a way, makes the change slower than we expected. Now, the context is simultaneously historical, this idea of the overlap of things that are changing, and not a simple palimpsest, but it's also something related to capital circulation and policy decision, which is not written there, at different levels that interact, regional, national, and more global. Secondly, there is the issue of deregulation or decommodification. So there is more relevance of the market for the past 20 or 30 years. And in the case of Southern Europe, there is also the role of the groups of people. We cannot set aside the capacity of the social movements to influence policies. That's why, and now making the bridge between policy and research, that's why several of us believe that research has an engaged component and can contribute to the change caused by us all as a group. The practical thing. So 20 years ago, there was this article which I wrote, that is the extensive research, or the beginning of that. And the idea of the article was basically, I'm not going into details here, so I'll go quickly to the end, to enhance these two ideas. That there was some commonality in the spatial segregation of Southern European, or what I called at the time the Northern European metropolises, to distinguish from the Southern Mediterranean metropolis of North Africa. And the two ideas were, then there are the explanations for the process that you have here, but especially two things. That compared to the North, spatial segregation was lower, and secondly, the suburbanization of migrants was higher. And based on these two common elements, we could assume that there was a kind of common pattern to all these cities in terms of the place where migrants cluster more. That here there are some examples. So when we compare Birmingham and Rotterdam, we see that for two important groups, the Turks and the Indian ethnics, in the case of Birmingham, they were much closer to the center. And when we compare this with the African nationals in Lisbon and the Moroccans in Milan, they were further away from the city center. Just to illustrate empirically what I was saying. Now, 20 years had passed, and it is clear that there was, from my part, an excessive generalization and somehow an oversimplification of the process mechanisms that conducted to this. In addition, there were important changes, especially after that coincide and continue with the financial crisis that started in 2007 and 2008, and which have an impact on how segregation changes. Some of the examples are here, the global financialization, because financialization started before. It just became much progressively more internationalized and with an higher direct influence of foreign banks and other foreign financial structures, which were targeting strongly the real estate market. There was larger decommodification, and then a change to rehabilitation, largely sponsored by public processes. Now, along these 20 years that have passed, there was a lot of work about socio-ethnic segregation in Southern European cases, which have clearly contributed to deepen and to deconstruct some of the ideas that were presented 20 years ago in that, let us say, simple article on Northern Mediterranean cities. Here there are some of the people, I'm not being fair because I'm leaving others aside, here there are several people which have contributed strongly to get a much better analysis and a much stronger analysis of what is segregation in Southern European cities nowadays and how the process developed along these decades. And I wanted to enhance the work of Sónia Alves. She's a friend and a great researcher, as several of you, maybe all of you know her. This is the book that she published in 2019. And the book goes a much longer way than what was envisaged 20 years ago. So in terms of understand the process and discuss it. Now, one of the things that she shows is that internally Southern European cities have differences, and that there are key issues associated to welfare regimes to understand segregation. Here we have, is not segregation regimes, is the relationship between the percentage of immigrant population and the segregation indexes. And what we do see is that it's true that Southern European cities have lower segregation indexes, but still Milan is much lower than Lisbon. And then when we compare the cities of, for instance, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands or Belgium, they have higher segregation indexes, but still some differences in terms of percentages of immigrant population. So more or less the same percentage of immigrant population don't provide necessarily the same segregation indexes. In Birmingham or Brussels, they were much higher than in Amsterdam and The Hague, that they were higher as well. So there are common patterns, but there are strong internal differences. Now, she made and gave us an excellent analysis on how there is a relationship between segregation and welfare state regimes. And she said, in the analysis she made, that the issue was not just to have into consideration the housing regimes and the welfare regimes, especially in the domain of housing, but also to combine them with other issues. For instance, the scale of housing production. Here you have the classical three welfare state regimes, according to the work of our Swedish pioneer, and the fourth welfare state regime with an old name, which is the one of Southern Europe. And this is the one where segregation is higher, because it combines both a process by which liberalization is stronger and a higher scale of housing production. The place where segregation tends to be lower is where the welfare state regime has led to a lower level or a smaller level of commodification, and at the same time the scale of production is lower. So it is the combination of factors, and this is what is enhanced here, that help us to understand the segregation issues. So we had the emigration in the previous slide, and now we have scale of production and the tenure balance in terms of housing regimes. These are some of the key ideas that Arbaci brought. The first is socio-ethnic segregation and social marginalization are not totally connected. There can be, and we'll see this in a minute, and I'm getting to the end, it's 5 minutes more. We can have increasing housing hardship in moments where the groups which are experiencing that hardship are reducing the segregation levels. Second, welfare state regimes, degrees of decommodification are crucial to understand ethnic segregation. But it is the combination of all these issues, especially if we combine the action of the four classical types of factors, that make us understand what happens in each of the metropolises and in each of the countries. Then it is the issue of migration features that we've talked about. And then there are two, let us say, common issues. The first one is that there are, maybe we cannot talk about a simple model of Southern Europe, but there are a set of common elements that show that there is more similarity than when compared to other spaces of Europe and even of the globe. So there is still lower levels of segregation. And there is an association, for instance, between the residential geographies of native and foreign groups. There wasn't, for instance, a transition of labor class areas and working class areas to migration areas. That happened in other cities, but not in the case of Southern European cities. Finally, the dynamics analysis that she provided shows that there are two hallmarks that we must take into consideration. The first one is dispersal of the, in this case, non-EU immigrant groups. And this dispersal obviously takes to peripheralization, difficult word in English, peripherization. But this happens in a context of housing inequality. It doesn't mean that to be more scattered means a better housing condition. She called this urban diaspora. Then she explains in the book in a very nice way why she calls it urban diaspora, in this idea of a diaspora scattering a certain population, in this case scattering in the peripheries of the metropolitan areas. This is the example for Lisbon for this period, so the period which is before the crisis. These bars here show that the overcrowded dwellings of most of the migrant groups either remained the same or increased, the case of Brazilians and South Asians and Chinese, but actually declined for the Portuguese and the EU citizens. This is just one variable. There are others that show that housing stress actually was worsened in this period for the migrants, but not segregation. In most of the cases, what we have is a reduction of segregation. This is just the example for Lisbon. What Sonia was saying is that we can desegregate, but not necessarily improve housing conditions. Of course, in this period in Lisbon, there was a process that improved the conditions of some migrants, but just some, and especially descendants, which was paired. But it improved in terms of the physical condition of the housing, not necessarily of the urban conditions of living in the neighborhood. And there was peripheralization and marginalization. When we compare the Cape Verdeans, an old group which is concentrated very close to the limits of the city, with the new arrivals of Brazilians of this period, we see this process of scattering and marginalization. It would be important, and I don't have it here, to analyze the process that goes along the time. This idea of scattering is very interesting when we look at the Chinese, because they are a smaller group and they have residential presences or concentrations in several spots, not just outside the metropolis, but also inside the metropolis, in this case, inside the city of Lisbon. Now, finally, the post-crisis period. So we know that there was this process of financialization, especially of strong increase in home ownership. This is the LMA process. The strong expansion of credit, the indebtedness of the people that had consequences during the crisis. Then there was this process which my friend Luis Mendes knows a lot and analyzed extensively, though he is younger, which is about a strong increase of foreign investment in high-standing housing. This was a poster that was at the Lisbon airport. We don't see it anymore, but it was at the Lisbon airport, which was clearly stimulating, in this case, Chinese, to use the Golden Visa program to invest in housing, which they actually did, because 90% of the program targets housing investment. The program is being discontinued now after, I think, 10 years, as far as I can remember. Now, there were other programs, and the result is there was an increasing presence of first of French residents, then of several other EU European citizens, Western European. Then, for instance, in 2016, 25% of the housing transitions involved foreigners. And Lisbon, Porto, and the Algarve were the main targets. So internationalization, especially of the higher stages of the housing market. These are another example of the process with some data that show the presence of the foreign investors and also of foreign capital as the one that pays the credit for housing, or the ones that actually build the houses as well. So it is a foreign presence which touched the three components: finance, migrants, and the enterprises planning or making the projects and building. This is another example, which is how the number of transactions involving foreign people increased, and there was a slight decrease, and also the impact on prices that have increased substantially. The prices increased because the foreign demand, which can pay much more, especially in the central areas, increased substantially. And this is one of the reasons why the people cannot no longer afford to live in the center. Now, when we look into the immigrants, we see that in 2001, the scattered patterns continue. We see it for the Brazilians, we see it a little bit for the Guinea-Bissau citizens. But we do see another thing, is that the historical strength of the structures makes that when you compare these maps with the maps of 2001, the major concentrations are more or less in the same places. Because we are looking at this at the level of Frexia, we don't notice detailed changes. What we also see, and this is very clear here, is that when we compare the EU15 pattern, and this is 2011, so the change in the process at only 4 years, so it was very recent, they have a stronger presence in the city of Lisbon, and then in the good west coast of Cascais, Estoril. And this continues and increases. Here I made a deviation. We'll change the China, Pakistan, and India. Segregation indexes started to grow again. And I'll go back to this at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to show this map. Because in this map, we don't have ethnic segregation. We have social, or representation of the social classes. And this is social class 2, which is liberal professional. I don't know, there is another name in English for this. And what is interesting, these are the areas where they have an higher presence. And if we look, and this is a dynamic process based on census data. So they are in those good areas of the eastern part of Lisbon and along the coast of Oeiras Cascais. We do see that they have increased their presence in these areas. Slowly, and even before the changes in 2007 and 2008. So the idea of an higher concentration in these areas, and again I say that we are not having immigrants here, points to a higher degree of this differentiation, which possibly may have caused or contributed to higher levels of segregation. Now when you compare this with other groups, and here you have middle class, middle class, we see that it is much more scattered, especially in places where the number is higher, much more scattered in the metropolitan area. So this idea of peripheralization is not just associated to new groups of migrants, but also to the national middle classes, which is in line with that idea of Sonia Alves that there is some overlapping or commonality between the presences of the groups that cannot afford the central spaces. Now, if we move into the low-skilled, this is interesting because the low-skilled are more present in the city center than the middle classes, because their capacity of moving to new houses is smaller, and so they remain in some spaces that you probably recognize, where they have reduced, if you compare 2001 2011, and they are present in spaces where you still have concentration of social housing, in the east part of Lisbon
in the northern part of Lisbon, Chanerca and Amechoeira, and here in east, where you have the area of Ajuda, which has a large concentration of social housing estates. Some of these areas resist as clusters of deprived housing and social disadvantage. This is one example which persists for years. You also identify it here. Now, reaching the conclusion, what can we think about socio-ethnic segregation in the future? So there are three processes which have started some years ago and which I believe that they have all the conditions to continue with some changes. One is the internationalization of capital that is invested in real estate with the direct intervention of agents in this area. Financialization won't disappear. This is associated to this idea that housing is still assumed very much as a financial commodity, and this is assumed by the agents, but often by people, and in the case of Southern Europe, picking up this tradition of property as a key asset in our lives. So this combination of social expectations associated to having the property of a housing and the financial gains of the housing business make the house probably more and more a financial commodity. Finally, there is an increasing social and economic value associated to the central areas of cities, leading to gentrification and touristification. I didn't speak very much about touristification, also because it's not a topic which I explore very much, and there are people who do it much strongly, and there are projects specific about this, which give us a lot of information about touristification. But this valuing of the central areas of cities means that processes of filtering up are taking place and are expected to continue in the future. But the problem of the future is that we need data to analyze things, and we hope to have the 2021 census data to see what happened in the last decade and to think better and what will take place in the future. This is speculative now. We believe that social homogeneity in the historical centers will increase. So the process of filtering up will reserve the city centers more for foreigners, higher classes, and elite migrants, some of them who circulate very much from one city to the other. Because they circulate a lot, because this is mixed with tourism, this idea of community historically associated to the traditional neighborhoods will probably disappear, or it may transform in a new, completely different thing with communities which are connected digitally. That's an hypothesis. The other thing is that the trends of peripheralization of non-EU immigrants, as well as lower and middle classes, will certainly continue. That scattering thing will probably continue. And then the other element, which is micro-segregation processes, can also take place. So because there is a combination of elements that contribute to segregation, we can probably identify in the city centers and even in the peripheries this coexistence of areas where high classes concentrate and low classes concentrate, where clandestine housing is, and new areas of the periphery associated to gate communities may be as well, or where rehabilitated houses in the city center have already suffered a process of gentrification, but close by, because there is a program of the municipality, we have some low-income groups, or because some houses are slower to transform themselves, there are still low-income and aged population in the city center. So the micro-segregation processes is something that is now having more attention by the academic community, and it's a process that probably has increased. We'll see later with this. Finally, there might be a slight increase in general patterns of segregation due to this concentration of higher classes and EU migrants in the center and the scattering of others outside. If the scattering is very strong, actually segregation won't increase. Now, what can counter this process is first the resilience of the city. So we won't find very different patterns from the ones we had in 2011. especially in 2021. Processes are slow. There are elements of the city which don't change in 1 year or even in 10 years. But we notice the changing process. The second is how the social movements can resist to the housing change. How can they claim the possibility of remaining in the center? And also how government at different levels can enhance the effectiveness of welfare state in terms of ensuring housing as a right and not just as a process, as something which is a good for exchange and making profit. So we depend very much on the strength of these two things to have different patterns. Thank you and sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And just a sort of side note, having researched something extensively doesn't necessarily translate into being older. It could be related to dedication or motivation and many other things other than age. But anyway, thanks for that presentation. I think we'll come back to it in the discussion afterwards. So now we can move on to the second presentation of the day. It's my pleasure to introduce Andreas Hendricks. So Professor Hendricks is a surveyor and he's got a vast international experience in land management. He's currently lecturing in the Department of Civil Engineering and Environmental Science at the University of Bundeswehr in Munich. And he's also lectured in the past in Buenos Aires and New Brandenburg. And also besides his academic positions, he's worked also in the public sector and for the surveying authority of Karlsruhe. His research and scientific outputs relate to land management and policy and also real estate valuation. And his most recent publications are in the area of public value capture or developer contributions or obligations. And the potential that this offers for a more socially equitable land use policy, whether that's for public facilities or the production of affordable housing. And that's what he's going to speak to us about today. And his presentation is entitled Urban Renewal and the Use of Development Obligations to Provide Social and Affordable Housing. So, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just starting the presentation, if you don't mind, during my presentation. Then I don't have to turn around always. If I have to want to show you something on the slides. Can you understand me or do I have to use a micro? Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Like Jennifer said, I will focus more on the financial aspects of our development and also the opportunity to get financing meant for affordable housing. So it's also touched the topic of social inclusion. So the first part will more or less a small commercial part for our cost action, and then I will give a more or less theoretical framework what public value capture is in our understanding of this cost action. A short introduction in tools of public value capture in general, and then specifically developer obligations. And finally, I will give you an overview about the regulations in Munich, that's the city where I'm living. Sorry, which is? Oh, no, I cannot. Okay. So this cost action is a European network project, and so maybe you will ask, why do you handle this topic, public value capture? German municipalities, probably as well as in other European countries, we have situations that municipalities have decreasing means to fulfill all their public commitments, so you have to provide infrastructure, you have to provide social infrastructure, education, and so on. And the basic idea was to disencumber the public budget, to have more budget for other duties like providing infrastructure. And this network project itself, because we have a lot of European countries included, the idea was to improve existing tool on the one hand, because we have countries that have similar situations concerning public value capture. On the other hand, we have totally different levels of public value capture. And then you might get thought-provoking impulses in some countries. So we started in 2018 with a quite small group of 9 scientists from 7 countries, and we have grown considerably. So now we have more than 100 scientists and also administrative stakeholders from around 40 countries. It's a quite good balanced group in terms of gender balance and also inclusion of so-called inclusiveness target countries with a low level of research. And we are close to finish our cost action, so it will end in August 2022. For this reason, we have also some output. I give you here some links if you're interested in these publications. We have a special issue in Sustainability Journal. We will publish a book, hopefully in July, August 2022. Like always, it's not sure that we can make that, but it will be published around that. It will be also open access. And also there will be another important result will be an implementation report. So the book focuses more on the current situation of public value capture and the implementation report on proposals to improve the current situation. And that will be also published on our website. So I can leave also this presentation to you, Sonia. So if you're interested, you can send an email to Sonia, or also, of course, to me if you're interested in. So of course, public value capture is not a totally new topic. There's some literature on it. I will not go through all definitions that already exist. So we have a quite broad understanding of public value capture in our cost action. So the definition is the term of public value capture includes all instruments that capture all possible increases of the value of land and buildings, whether they are considered as taxes or not. So it was important for us to include also buildings because a lot of taxes or tax systems include also buildings in the calculation. However, very important in this for the theoretical background of public value capture discussion is this term unearned benefits. So mostly in a lot of countries it focuses on this so-called unearned benefits, so that are benefits of the landowner or developers that are not related to his actions, but actions of the public authorities, for example, planning gains. And the reciting funds that the municipalities get out of these public capture activities, they are oftentimes earmarked for specific purposes. That must not be that way, but it's quite common. So recovery of development costs, this is a very typical developer obligation, but it might also include affordable housing. That's why I'm talking here today. So this is a categorization. What are the reasons for value increase? So why do we have a difference between the value of farmland and the value of building land? And very important is this development phase. So we have especially this planning, plans and permits, so these planning gains that are just a consequence of this planning. And so the developer or landowner does not provide any actions to that. So for this reason, we call it especially that so-called unearned benefits. Then we have a value increase due to the provided infrastructure, on the one hand technical infrastructure or internal infrastructure, but also so-called social infrastructure. Then, of course, we have a price increase due to the construction of the buildings. This is basically a result of the private investments, but may include also a certain share of this external and social infrastructure. I will come back to that in the next slides. And then we have a general price increase due to, for example, due to higher demand or because of population growth, migration, and so on. So there's a wide agreement to capture value increases from this infrastructure provision. So there's no doubt about that you can do that. And most countries have a certain kind of tools that are focused on this refinancing. In several countries, the construction are included in the tax calculation. I told you that before. And also their economic development may be subject to taxes or fees. So some countries have a quite wide understanding of this public value capture, but legislation of particular countries may limit it also to individual parts of this price increase. I'm going back. So this is a categorization to understand what are the reasons for the price increase, but they don't tell you anything how big this price increase is. Yeah, so it's just here it's, let's say, 10%, and here it's 100%. But in Munich, 100% maybe 1,000 euros. In a rural area, maybe just 30 euros. Yeah. So if you say, okay, you want to capture, so there, statistically, it's more or less that around 50% are planning gains. Yeah, of this price increase from farmland to building land. And if you say, I want to capture 50% of the planning gains, then in cities like Munich, it might be 500 euros per square meters. In rural areas where land values are much slower, it's just 15 euros per square meters. Now, for this reason, this whole public value capture discussion or this tool is, of course, mostly established in areas where we have high land values. And there are reasons for these differences in land values. Of course, on the one hand, it's a discussion of demand and available buildings. Yeah, so supply and demand. Another important point is our public services. So what are infrastructure, social infrastructure of social services exist? Is there a good healthcare and education and so on? But also environmental amenities. Yeah, if the city is located close to the Alps, like Munich, where you are close to the skiing areas, or it's close to a nice lake or whatever, then you have generally higher land values, but also the monetary policy. Yeah, and after financial crisis, the prices went down in the first place, but nowadays when we have a very low interests, the prices increased about 25%. So this is also a driver of land values. So the first slide I saw you, this categorization, why land values are increasing. This categorization is useful to answer the question how who should capture what, and the last slide is an explanation how much can be captured. So, on the one hand, we have this reasons for price increase, and for our cost action we needed also a certain kind of classification to establish this international comparison between more than 30 countries. So we decided to use this type of classification. Again, there is some literature using other kinds of differentiation. For example, Rachel Elterman, maybe someone of you know her as a very well-known planner from Israel. She established another kind of categorization, but it was quite difficult to handle in our opinion, so we used that one in our cost action. So we distinguish between recurring and so-called non-recurring forms of public values. So recurring forms are basically taxes and payments in case of sale and purchase, for example, real estate transfer tax or capital gain tax. And on the other hand, we have non-recurring forms, on the one hand focusing on one factor of value increase, for example, fees for infrastructure, and tools focusing on more than one factor of this price increase. And these are developer obligations. So developer obligations are one possible tool of public value capture belonging to this group of non-recurring forms focusing on more than one factor. So I will now focusing on this tool in the remaining time that I have. So developer obligations are generally negotiated between a developer and the municipality. But it is important that the municipality takes into account not just the interests of the developer, but also the public interest. Yeah, it should be not selling out planning objectives, so it should be a regular planning, but backed up with the financing of the developer. Generally, or the most common duties that are agreed in these contracts is the provision of the needed area for infrastructure or the provision of plots for social, public, or ecological objectives. But also an option is affordable housing. On the one hand, it is a nice tool to get some financial means for these objectives, but on the other hand, we have certain limits for the implementation or establishment of developer obligations. On the one hand, generally there's a certain kind of regulation by law that all this regulation must be adequate. But then the question is, what does that mean? What is an adequate regulation? In Germany, we relate that to the benefits of the development in total. So in Germany, we have it's generally established to capture 2/3 of the development benefits. So you get, on the one hand, but you cannot just ask for money, but all the obligations, for example, payment for infrastructure, can be equivalent to 2/3 of this development benefits. In other countries, you have oftentimes regulations that are just based on maybe square meter residential floor space that will be constructed, or a certain amount of money per apartment or something like that. Yes, this is less effort because you don't have to do any calculations, but on the other hand, you have no reference to profitability. For this reason, it may happen that if it's in the first place, it seems to be an equal treatment of developers. If you say each developer has to pay, let's say, 100 euros per square meter, but on the other hand, it might be an unequal treatment because some developments are much more profitable than others. So for this reason, we prefer that way, even if it's, on the one hand, you need a lot of information, you need a lot of data and experts to do these calculations, but in my opinion, it's finally the better solution. Despite of this adequacy discussion, we have also this potential problem of spatial and factual limits. So this is related to this causality or connection between development and development obligation. Like I mentioned before, in Germany at least, you cannot just ask for money from the developer. You just can ask for money to refine or to finance something. So for example, to finance new streets, to finance a kindergarten for this new development or new school, or to finance affordable housing in this area. This is possible in Germany. In other countries, for example, in Belgium, the highest court ruled that the provision of affordable housing is not close enough to this development, so that's, this connection is not given in that case. But it's different from country to country. It is recommendable, in my opinion, because there's oftentimes discussion what can be financed or what not. And for this reason, we decided, for example, in Germany, I will come back to that, to make a basic regulation by law, what is possible and what not. But this is just a toolbox, so the municipalities don't have to establish all of these objectives, but it's to clarify what are legal objectives of these so-called urban contracts. And then it's reasonable on the municipal level that they make a basic decision by the municipal council to increase the transparency and the equal treatment of stakeholders. And concerning the spatial limits, it is the question, can off-site infrastructure, so infrastructure outside of the development area, can this infrastructure also be financed or not? And this is a point where I think there's more research needed, what will hopefully be done after our post-action. So in Germany, we have the following situation. So the classical developments that we in Germany have is by land consolidation. So it is first planning. So up to here, we have a planning. We have in Germany, we have a two-step planning. We have two plans. We have a so-called preparatory land use plan, and afterwards a legally binding land use plan. And we have a massive price increase due to these planning steps. And afterwards, we have generally land consolidation. And if we have this classical way of development, we can just capture this part. and we have no access to these planning gains. Because our highest courts decided if the plan is already approved, it is part of the property, and then you cannot capture it. But if you try to capture it before the plan approval, then it's just a chance of price increase, and then you can capture it. Yeah, so what the municipalities nowadays oftentimes do, it is a kind of blackmailing, finally. Yeah? Not in legal terms, but in fact it is a kind of blackmailing. So they say to the developer, okay, if you want to have a plan approval for the area, we will just approve the plan if you accept to give a certain share of this price increase to refinance development costs. Otherwise, you will not get the plan approval. Yeah, so this is the idea to capture also part of this price increase. So, like I mentioned before, this was finally a consequence of the German reunification, when especially the new Eastern federal states had no idea about this handling urban contracts. And then we established this Article 11 in the German building code to clarify what are legal objectives of urban contracts. So you can hire someone to make the plans. That is one option. Then you can hire someone to prepare building activities, so to for the demolition of old buildings and so on, so for elimination of plants. And you can also regulate the use of the plots. This is normally done by planning, but you can also regulate it in this so-called urban contracts. Very important point in Germany is ecological compensation, but also social housing supply. Yeah, so this is regulated by law that this is possible in Germany. And yeah, and plots for locals also. This is, yeah, despite of social housing, this is also an important objective in Germany. Yeah, there has been a strict connection between obligation and development. That's what I mentioned before, so I would skip that slide. And concerning this principle of adequacy, yeah, so in Germany, also Munich was one of the first cities that who established this kind of urban contracts, and they are capturing 2/3 of the benefits. And because Munich was one of the first cities, and other cities more or less copied this Munich model, so it is generally established to capture up to 2/3. Yeah, there are currently discussions why not capturing more. Yeah, because there is no legal rule by law, or unfortunately neither a decision by highest court that not can be captured 80 or 90%. Yeah, why not? So of course, if it's up to 100%, then there's no incentive for the developer to invest. So that would be not reasonable. About yeah, that could be also more. So the Sobon, so this is regulations that we have in Munich. When we started, we had a potential area for 60 accommodation units, and the target was to build around 5,000 to 6,000 accommodation units per year. But the Munich, when we started this Munich model was around 25 years ago. They just had not the money to invest. So the aims of Sobon was yeah, to share the costs. And furthermore, of course, to have moderate housing creation. So what we wanted is a social mix in new accommodation. So not to have a certain area where we have all social housing and in others not. The idea was to have in each development area a certain share of social and affordable housing. The development process is a basic agreement between developer and municipality. Then starting of the development process, the planning process, then the basic contact before adopting the plan. That's why what I mentioned before, after plan approval we cannot capture in Germany. Yeah, but it's maybe not so important. And what's more important is this slide. So like I told you, we can capture up to 2/3. Yeah, so if you have here The original value of the land is 30 million euros of the development area. After the development, we have 130 million euros. So the development, the benefits of the development is 100 million euros. So it would be captured 2/3 of this 100 million, so 67 million could be captured. Yeah, to refinance urban duties. Yeah, so for public infrastructure, social infrastructure, this is for the housing program. And in this case, there was more money left because you cannot just capture money. You cannot say, give me this 2/3. This, in this case, 67 million. You have always to have an argument for what this money has to be used. Yeah, you cannot just go in the public budget. So, short statistic overview, what we reached in the between 1994 and 2019, more or less. So we constructed floor space for 4.7 million square meters. That is equal to accommodation units of more or less 53,000. And out of these 53,000, 14,500 have been in housing programs. Furthermore, we could refinance roadway costs of 207 million euros and social infrastructure of around 240 million euros. So, yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I think we will answer questions then at the end of the event.
Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation, Andreas. Now we're going to move on to our last presentation of the afternoon. I'm delighted to introduce Marta Rodrigues Neves, and Marta's work focuses on interethnic relations in urban contexts, with a special focus on segregated spaces, but she brings a sort of new perspective to more traditional residential segregation approaches by looking at segregation in activity spaces, perceptual segregation, and also social network segregation. She's finishing her doctoral studies. I think she's almost at the very end in the Department of Political Science and Public Management at the University of Southern Denmark. And she's also worked on urban sustainability projects for various other institutions as well. And her presentation today is entitled Migration and the City, Encountering Diversity. So, Marta, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and congratulations on the beautiful presentations. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I find particularly fascinating, which is encountering people who are different from us in cities that are becoming more and more diverse. And the basic assumption is, the basic premise is that cities are becoming more diverse. And according to the latest available predictions, in about 28 years, in 2050, we are going to be around 10 billion people on Earth. That's what is expected. And right now we are about 8 billion, meaning that we will have an increase of about 2 billion people. And when we look into the predictions about urban population growth, we see that we will also have a 2 billion increase. So right now we are about 4 billion people living in cities, and in 2050 we are going to be about 6.3 billion people. And basically, if there is an increase of 2 billion people living on Earth, and there will be also a 2 billion increase of people living in cities, it means that this population growth will be exclusively be felt in cities. And when we think about this population growth, of course, this is due to a natural process of people living longer lives and lower mortality rates. But if we think about urban population growth, then we have to think about a different process, which is migration, of course. And the cities that are expected to grow the most are actually those in the global south. And in this case, yes, it's going to be also due to better lives, people living longer lives, and also due to migration. But this migration in the global south is mostly internal to the country. So people are leaving the countryside and moving to cities. But then we have a different story when it comes to high-income cities in what is called the global north. in which the increase in urban population is not going to be so much due to better lives, but mostly due to migration. And this migration is a little bit more complex because it is also an internal process of people moving from the countryside to cities, but it is also international migration. So if we are talking about international migrations, this of course is going to imply, and it is already implying, a complexification of ethnicities in cities. And this is why, especially since 2007, we start talking about some European and Northern American cities as super diverse cities. And what is this concept? The concept is that, well, these cities are extremely diverse, but we don't even have a big majority group of natives living together with some minority groups. Right now, we have a proliferation of these minority groups. And if we think, for example, about London or New York, cities are made of minorities more than having this big majority group and then minority groups. And this is something that sometimes we see this phenomenon of superdiversity already being referred to in Lisbon, but it is particularly used to describe bigger metropolis. But this is at least a prediction for Lisbon, if it is still not reality right now. And of course that if cities are going to be more diverse, this is going to bring opportunities and challenges. This diversity will come to enrich our urban lives, but it is also going to bring up new challenges, because people who have never had to be exposed to difference now will have to live side by side with this difference. And while me having been born in a city and always have faced diversity, for me it's something that maybe it's very natural, but we cannot take for granted that some people have actually lived in homogeneous communities their whole lives, and this is an actual challenge that people live and face in their daily lives. And because cities are indeed becoming more diverse and more people are living in cities than in the literature in the past years, we see a renewed interest in the potential of intercultural encounters. And in this literature, we see these intercultural encounters, that is, people with different ethnicities, for example, encountering each other in their everyday lives. Some authors look into these encounters with great optimism. These are great opportunities for nurturing tolerance, for us to open our horizons. But some authors see these as more pessimistic. And so we kind of have this big debate going on about whether these are actually good or bad. And of course, the answer lies a little bit in between, because we find evidence of both. And one of the scholars that I admire the most is his name is Ryan Enos, and he does research mostly in segregated cities, mostly in North America, but he also does some studies and social experiments in other cities. He is one of the authors that has found both optimistic and pessimistic evidence of these in these encounters. So some of his social experiments really show that, well, if people are in contact with difference for enough time, so there is a time element, and under ideal conditions, people can actually become more tolerant due to these encounters. However, he unfortunately also finds pessimistic evidence, and this is actually most often the case, especially in cities that are segregated, which means that people live side by side but not together. So it's a little bit like Jorge Malheiros' pictures. They do look at each other, they do share some spaces, but they do not necessarily go to the same schools, they do not necessarily go to the same workplaces even, or are part of the same networks. And in these cases where people are actually faced with diversity, yet they are not completely integrated, we see precisely the opposite. We see that it is actually a source of urban hostility, and we see this if we in studies we see that this influences the way people vote and the policies that they support. But because I'm an optimist, I would like to start a little bit with these more optimistic observations of intercultural contact. Because there is also some evidence that this can be actually a great way to nurture tolerance and social cohesion in our societies. And if it is true that intercultural contacts can bring tolerance, definitely then cities will become ideal spaces for integration, and this is because people in cities are almost obliged to be in contact with each other. Not necessarily, of course, because again we look into pictures like the ones we saw before, in which it is possible, if we have enough inequality, to not encounter difference in cities that are diverse. But because of higher population densities, in general, it is almost unavoidable in diverse cities to encounter people who are different from us. Right now it's about 4 p.m. and if I try to think of all of the encounters that I had with strangers, I wouldn't be able to count them. And especially me using public transportation, I think that this is an important factor in how many different people we encounter. But much of this research is really about psychological processes that we do not really see happening, right? So I may have walked through the street, encountered many different people and not realized because I was thinking about this presentation or something else. But what research in psychology shows is that even when we are not paying attention, sometimes our brains are kind of capturing this and really making us deconstruct stereotypes. We are becoming more familiar without even sometimes noticing. And the idea, prejudice, of course, we don't want discriminatory societies, and we are very critical in general of stereotypes, but the fact is that they are actually something that is innate to human beings, and it has to do with our evolutionary biology. Because many years ago in tribal societies, we needed to actually categorize people into boxes in order to fight the enemy, and the enemy looked different from us. So this is something that is very much in our human psychology that is innate to us. So a way of deconstructing these psychological processes is to actually see people enough times and create this sense of familiarity that then can indeed help deconstruct some of these images and these categorizations. And I think that some geographers have described these encounters as silent acts of kindness and civility in cities. I think this is a very romantic way of looking into intercultural encounters, but the whole idea is that, well, when you are, sometimes it can be something that is actually very kind, like holding an elevator door, or giving your seat on a bus to someone who is pregnant, or letting someone in the grocery stop go ahead of you. So these are actually active acts of kindness, but not necessarily. Sometimes it's really just not bumping into someone in the street. And these geographers look into these acts of kindness as a public display of tolerance, and they see this as a positive thing. And I have to say that in my own research, I have found evidence of these more optimistic, fleeting encounters. So in the first fieldwork that I did in 2020, I was living together, spending a lot of time with a group of Roma women in Porto. And after some days, I discovered that they are always telling me that some people living in the streets south to their social housing neighborhood, they are very kind, they are very nice. And then I just assumed that they knew each other, and in the end they didn't. They were just nicer, and I wanted to understand why they were nicer. And the reason, I mean, there were many reasons, but one of the main reasons was that in that street there are these little grocery shops, and they would go to these grocery shops and they would encounter people who lived in the streets as well. And they started greeting each other just because they recognized them. And sometimes it wasn't even greeting, it was just recognizing by looking at each other. And this was extremely important for these Roma women who feel discriminated in their daily lives. So this really shows that sometimes these fleeting encounters can really go a long way. Again, we tend to discard them as not important because, you know, we see each other just for 1 second, so what could that do? But really for these women, these encounters were extremely important for them to feel integrated. But unfortunately, this relationship between diversity and tolerance is not that clear, and indeed, many research shows that it can do precisely the opposite. It can actually fuel racism and not tolerance. And there is a tendency to romanticize contact in the literature, and actually the first person to caution us against doing this was the developer of the contact hypothesis himself. So it's Gordon Allport. So I work a lot with this theory. The contact hypothesis is a very simple theory in social psychology that says that intercultural contact can create intercultural tolerance. But some people just use this as a one-sentence thing, but what he says is that for this to be true, some conditions need to be fulfilled. Some of the original conditions were that people needed to have an equal status, or that they needed to have the support of the institutions, and that they needed to gather around common goals. But the point is, there has been so much research on contact hypotheses, and this list has increased, expanded, and been criticized. But the whole point is that context matters. Space matters, and therefore we shouldn't just take contact as something good for granted, but also give some attention to the context in which this contact exists. And again, a good example is, for example, I saw so many people in the metro today coming here, but my experience would have been completely different if now we had, again, segregation policies and I had to sit next to only native Portuguese. Because, again, these very psychological processes would force me to think about ethnicity. Because now I needed to sit next to native Portuguese, so it would be something that would make ethnicity more salient rather than less salient. And on the other hand, this context would probably tell me somehow that the reason why I was only sitting next to native Portuguese was because it was safer for me. So this context is actually very important, and it's going to frame contact and change the nature of encounters. So basic idea is that encounters do not happen in a vacuum, and there are pre-existing social and spatial inequalities that are going to shape the nature of these encounters. And these places have histories. Places have, we can think about, for example, the fact we cannot think about intercultural encounters here in Portugal without thinking about our past in colonialism. That's obviously, even in a way that we do not realize, is going to shape the way we interact with others. And another criticism is that I talked about these silent acts of kindness. Some authors really ask, but what are we really observing? Is it a silent act of kindness, or are we observing instead a form of public civility because we care about what people think of us, and we care about following social norms, and therefore we are nice to each other in public, but this is actually a superficial form of civility. So when we think about intercultural encounters, it is important to contextualize it also within broader structures that are, of course, shaped by state institutions and actors, and policy measures, campaigns, discourse on diversity really do influence also the nature of these encounters. And again, I have an example so I live in Denmark, and Denmark, for those who don't know, has a ghetto policy. So ever since 2010, the government has created a list of neighborhoods that are considered ghettos. And in order for a neighborhood to be a ghetto, it needs to house a concentration of immigrants with a non-Western background, so that's a necessity. And then on top of that, it should be a vulnerable area in other statistical indicators, usually higher crime rates, higher unemployability, but this changed throughout the years. So they have this ghetto list, and then in 2018, there was a highly criticized policy that was adopted by the government that was called No Parallel Societies in 2030. And basically what they adopted a series of policies that had to do with the deconstruction of some of these ghetto areas, but also enforcing higher penalties for crimes committed in these areas. People living in these areas needed to attend school to learn Danish values, things like this. And there has been a lot of attention to be paid to this in Denmark, of course, and there is also a lot of research about these encounters, because what is shown is that this discourse by the government on diversity is, of course, having a clear impact on how people interact in these areas. So two people meeting in a ghetto area, the nature of their encounter may be completely different if they were to meet somewhere else in the city, simply because they are in this ghetto area, and the whole idea of the ghetto is really created by this discourse of the government, and therefore it is really important to contextualize these intercultural encounters within these broader structures. So to conclude, what does this mean for the encounters between difference in the city? Well, first of all, I think the first thing to note is that we know that these encounters will exist, and they are going to be magnified in the coming years. So cities are going to be more diverse, cities are going to grow, and therefore we are going to meet people who are different from us, and it's almost going to be unavoidable. For this reason, these intercultural encounters deserve our fullest attention, and also because we know that they are not meaningless. They really can shape our individual attitudes for the better and for the worst, and the consequences are so great that, again, for this reason, they deserve our fullest attention. Then there needs to be a greater understanding of how context matters, and this is not to engineer social encounters, because I'd say that most academics are against these policies that try to engineer how people meet, even though many policymakers love them. But it is really to understand if the structures in our cities are pulling us apart or not. It is important to have this understanding if our cities are making us more hateful towards others, or if they are making us more tolerant. And finally, even though the literature I discussed was all about individual behaviors, of course, if enough people behave in a certain way, that has consequences for the entire society, because if enough people have negative attitudes and they do not want to cooperate with each other, that of course is going to impact the well-being of the country, economic, social, political well-being of the country, because especially in certain areas we actually as a society need to cooperate to tackle some problems, like deciding how we are going to invest our taxes, which infrastructures are we going to build, how are we going to defend our countries, and therefore we need to actually pay attention to these forms of intercultural encounters and social cohesion. But that is all, so thank you for your attention.
Marta, thank you so much for your presentation. So we've gone over time, but I think that we could be allowed perhaps another couple of minutes for questions. I think it's a pity just to close without time for debate or questions. So we've had three really rich, diverse presentations. So I think maybe we can try and bring them all together in the discussion. So maybe I'll just open up now to the floor. If anyone would like to make a comment or questions, Luis, you can start. That would be great.
Luis, the other part of the calling me, and also Jorge, and I think we also, but we just sorry. Okay, thank you for the three amazing presentations. I'm Luís Mendes, researcher in the team of SustainLis, and I love the three presentations. But my main question is going to be made to Marta. It's a theoretical question, and it has to do. This is very big. This is a thesis. So, how can, through intercultural practices, how can we and social mix? Can we enable social sustainability through urban regeneration, especially thinking about how can we achieve these thinking through residential mix? Because you said very well, space matters, residential space matters a lot. And this project is about urban rehabilitation and urban regeneration. So being a social psychologist, what kind of urbanism, even housing system or some kind of housing policy, what could you recommend to our politicians, for instance, to try to promote positive encounters through residential policy? What could you suggest if you had the opportunity to do so? Thank you so much. This question can be also answered by Jorge and Andreas, of course. Okay, because I have a feeling, maybe it's a prejudice, I don't know, but all the empirical studies prove that social engineered social mix through residential mix don't quite work. And I worked with Jorge and Rui, that just was here a minute ago, on that, and we tried to see if marginal gentrification, for instance, could promote some kind of encounter and really densify the social network in the neighborhoods where it would happen. And we didn't get to any kind of conclusion. So we ended reproducing the paradigm that, residential mix doesn't work to promote the social encounter. Thank you so much.
So maybe I could pick up another question from the floor before Marta answers. Yes, please.
Hi there. My name is Asaf Augustus from Bayreuth University in Germany. So, the question is to Professor Jorge. Since you have the historical element, my work doesn't deal directly with your presentation, but I met few participants in my studies who have said that 20 years ago Lisbon was not what we have today. So there's been lots of changes. They would say that 20 years ago it was common for landlords to clearly say that they don't want, for example, Africans to live in a particular area. They won't take them. But today is pretty much common to find so-called white areas being occupied by immigrants. And the second question is, I would argue that within this so-called minority areas, you do have so-called natives as well as living there, but there is sort of a difference, so to say. I'm just thinking of a particular example. There is a difference if I would say I live in na linha do Sintra, and if you say you live in a linha do Sintra, there is, people will sort of interpret completely a different story. I mean, the same thing. Can you repeat that one? I would say there is a difference if I would say I live in a linha da Sintra. That's what the people often say. If a white person would say he lives also in a linha da Sintra, there is also a difference. If I would say, for example, I live in Neukölln in Berlin, would completely mean something else if a white person would say lives in Neukölln. So those things need to be play out clearly. That would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Seth. Now I'll just pass it over to Andreas, Jorge and Marta to respond.
Yeah, maybe I can start. So I'll try to answer your question as best as possible. And I agree that actually the evidence points to social mixing not being the best solution. And the main reason is that actually just because they live in the same neighborhood, people do not necessarily interact. And sometimes actually it creates the opposite. So actually it creates this idea of defending the territory. And in most cases, this is the evidence that is found. There is a tendency of the past years of just mixing people around, just taking them away from where they live in order to mix them up, and also through gentrification processes. And it seems like it's not doing a lot. And what some researchers suggest is that maybe we should focus instead integration in activity spaces, what is called the micropublics, and maybe focus in other spaces like schools, or again, in my own research, the grocery stores and cafes seem to be a really important place for these women to actually get integrated with people from outside the biosocial. But one thing that I noticed from my own research is that it really matters when we are talking about these policies of mixing people in neighborhoods. What are we talking about? Are we talking about mixing two groups that are actually different? Because this is maybe also the problem that I think that should be discussed in the literature. Because if we are trying to mix people who are very different from each other, the likelihood that they will integrate is going to be lower than if you are trying to mix people who are a little bit more alike. In which case, the difference is not going to be as salient. This is from a social psychology perspective. Yet, again, I'm a little bit against social engineering intercultural encounters. I would say that best approach would be to just focus in places where people actually naturally meet these activity spaces.
Can I just make the second question? So do you agree with quotas? So I want to make a second question, which is, do you believe in the system of quotas in the new build real estate? For instance, every time that we build a new building, residential building, and we can give like 20% for social housing, the most lower socioeconomic status families, and the other ones is for normal middle class. Do you believe in that system of quotas, for instance? I'm just being very persistent because I loved your presentation, and being a social psychologist, I think you have a lot to say about this.
Okay, to be honest, I haven't thought about this, but I actually I've seen this work really well in some neighborhoods in Copenhagen. But I would have to think better about whether or not I support the policy. I know that there is a neighborhood in Copenhagen close to where I live where this has worked perfectly. Because it is done very well, because you have all stratums, and they try to also create diversity in other ways, so that you have families with children, for example, and older couples. And therefore you have a different idea of what difference is, right? So they are not just focusing on ethnicity, they are focusing on diversity in general. And therefore you go into that neighborhood, which is really nice, and it helps that there are rich people living there, because they have the political and economic power to make the area nice. But at the same time, you do not go into the area and think, okay, I'm in a privileged, gated community. But I would need to think about whether or not I support this as a policy. But yes. Yes.
Yes, thank you for the questions. We can have a discussion about this. The first issue is about the mix results of mix, because it's hard to be. I didn't talk about the policies to fight more expressly the issue of segregation and what is assumed as the negative outcomes of socio-ethnic segregation. But mix is typically the most discussed policy in this domain. Now, for instance, the example of marginal gentrification processes in the city center is not exactly a policy, it was a process, bottom-up process, protagonized by a set of people that started to buy or to rent their flats in an area with other features. So when these people actually had more cultural capital than actually economic capital at the beginning. It is true then that the result was a mix in their heads, or an intention of mix, much stronger than actual mix in terms of convivialidade. I don't know if the English word conviviality exists, but it is the idea of conviviality. So it was the wish to be in a diverse neighborhood, and the wish to experience the diverse neighborhood was stronger than the actual living of the diverse neighborhood. But maybe these things take time, and there are also different uses of time and space by the group of the people that have arrived and the others. But anyway, this is just to show that this more organic mixing process had limits as the planned mixed processes. And now, thinking in what Asaf was saying, it is true that Lisbon has changed, and especially the city of Lisbon. Things are changing pretty fast, especially since the economic crisis, in these terms of urban offer and the population living in the various spaces of the city, and also activities, namely the ones related to tourism, which are a recent change. And we also see the effects of rehabilitation in several neighborhoods. But in terms of social structures, the changes are not enormous. The spaces which are associated to middle and high classes still have a proportion of people of these classes that is larger than the people of other classes. In some cases there are stronger changes, in others there are smaller changes. And it's especially the historical center, the goal of this project, where we feel faster and deeper changes in terms of population transition. There was depopulation, now there is still depopulation, but at a lower level. There are new arrivals. We'll see now when we have more data at the Freguesia level what is the transition that actually took place, because we feel, and we have data from questionnaires and interviews that point to this transition in terms of migrants. And when we're talking about migrants, it's not just, for instance, South Asians in Moraria, it's also about Western Europeans in Moraria, for instance, and also about the class issue. And the class issue is fundamental to understand, for instance, what you were saying. You're saying that some people tell you that now there is apparently, I don't know if more mixed, but at least more possibilities for, you were saying about Africans or black people, to buy houses easily or to be accepted by landlords in areas where 20 years ago that was hard. I believe that this is probably much truth, for eventually three reasons. First reason is we made some studies about housing discrimination, and there were campaigns and an effort to fight housing discrimination that may have some effect. Housing discrimination was not very strong, and I'll tell you why I think, but it existed. And these campaigns may have reduced it even more. But why was not, for instance, very strong in our study? Because race and class are combined. So there is the issue of intersectionality. And it was not strong because the group of people that were testing housing discrimination were all emulating young, skilled people. So in this case, the issue of class was important for the potential landlords who wanted to hire the houses, or the people that want to sell them. So I think this reduces the possibility of discrimination. Having said this,
we now also have much more higher presence, for instance, of higher classes from Africa, for instance, of Angolan elites in the city. Some of them which have used mechanisms such as the golden visa to buy homes here. Others didn't need the mechanism and just buy homes here. And because there is this issue of class, they have access basically to every area of the town. Probably we would still find some evidences of racism, but they would probably have access to every part of the house. And this shows some evidence of change. And the other one is internal mobility of the migrants. What happened with migrants, and we do see this, for instance, in Cape Verdean migrants, and probably we'll see it more with the data of the 2021 census, is that the number of Cape Verdeans in the home ownership sector increased from 2001 to 2011. And if this increases in several cases, it meant that they have moved from neighborhoods where the concentration of Cape Verdeans was higher to neighborhoods where the percentage of Cape Verdeans is a little bit lower. The lineage Sintra area is a quite good example. And this also leads to eventual higher level of mix, and especially to higher residential opportunities. As we have seen, segregation declined in the 90s, returned, but in very slow terms in the last decade. Now, having said this about Sintra, the other thing you were saying is there is obviously an issue of representation associated to how you are seen by yourself and by the others in relation to the place you mentioned you live. That is true. So the representation of being white and living in Sintra is not the same, or in lineage Sintra, especially in certain areas, is not the same representation of a black living in the same area. The same applies to class. In the area of Marvila Chelas here, if you belong to a low class, living in Chelas or Marvila would be assumed as something natural. We cannot naturalize social phenomena, but it's something natural. If you are from a high class and say you live in that area, that will probably mean, how can you live there? And the area is the same, because it's not expected by the others that somebody from the high classes lives in this space. So there is an association between the perception of the space and who actually is assumed by the group that can live there.
I'm not sure if there's maybe one last question. If anyone? No? Can I make a question, perhaps, just to finish off? Because I think there's sort of important maybe ties that we could make between some of the presentations, and I know that to bring it back to this idea of affordable housing that you were talking about, Andreas, in your presentation, I think we know in cities where affordable housing represents sort of quite an important pillar of housing policy, it actually fails very much to benefit migrant groups for different reasons, because perhaps they have a non-documented member in their household, or their income is too low, or perhaps they might even have sort of different housing needs, like need for multi-generational housing or something like that. So I'm wondering, is there any sort of measures or applications that we could think of that could make affordable housing more accessible to migrant groups? Yeah, or anyone else who wants to.
Okay. Well, I think at least in Munich, I think it's these programs for social or affordable housing depend mostly on the annual income. So, and of course, it's open also for migrants, at least if they, as long as they have a legal status. Of course, if they have no legal status, of course, it's a problem because they cannot apply or cannot be included in any administrative programs. So, but as long as they are legal, I think they have the same access as other people with low income in Germany. So there's no, there are no more restrictions for them. Of course, like I said, it is a problem as long as they have not a legal status. Yeah. If you'd want to.
Okay, I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't know if we should have special programs targeting migrants in the domain of housing. Probably not.
I think we should work out some things which are upstream. One is legalization, and associated to legalization, the access to the public programs of housing immediately. So, and now I believe that we have in Portugal a quite good program to legalize people that are already in the country. Probably is one of the most generous, probably not, it's one of the most generous of Europe. So in 1 year people can actually, with more or less trouble, try to legalize themselves if they have a job or they can try to start a business. And I think we should connect this to the housing opportunities. So not to create an exceptional situation for migrants, but to introduce this element of change, which is if people are legalized, they can have access to housing quickly. Then it is to extend clearly other opportunities, such as Primeiro Direito, for instance, one of the programs of the new generation of housing policies, to everybody, and then make it clear that it works for migrants. And thirdly, when, in this case, yes, it could be specific programs. In the case of programs that target temporary migrants, coming, for instance, for rural areas, there should be a much clearer process of housing these people. And because municipalities talk about this, some enterprises do it, but one of the crises we had recently is in this municipality, Odmira, that we all know. And I think it is because the housing responses were not there. And so there should be a stronger work in terms of finding, in this case for migrants, better housing responses. But to have a specific program targeting only migrants is complex. I think it's more the lever that takes migrants from changing, for instance, from collective, they stay, from collective housing for migrants to independent housing according to the schemes which are offered for the various population, or to associate legalization with housing opportunities.
Just add something, because I think you're totally right, because we had the situation some years ago when we had 2 million migrants in 1 year in Germany, and then we had some special programs for migrants, and we had massive problems because, of course, other persons who are also in this sector of social housing, they are looking at the other migrants and said, could look at him, he gets a new fridge or whatever, and he gets a much better than apartment than I get, and then you get massive problems if you have special programs for certain groups in this area.
But you do.
No.
Sorry, just as we were talking, I just realized that I have a friend in Munich, actually. There is a program, it's not necessarily targeting migrants per se, but they do look at the vulnerability of the people. If there's a single mother, a migrant, probably have a better chance to get a social housing than a single German, so to say. So there are programs, but obviously it's not so easy to get in as people think. Yeah, but there are programs out there targeting minorities, so to say, but each case is different.
Okay, yeah, that's it now. Sorry. Okay, I think that we should probably bring the session to a close, but I would just really extend my gratitude to the three presenters. I think you did excellent presentations. It was really interesting, I think, opening up these sort of new analytical avenues for thinking about ethnic segregation. One, we have sort of Marta's work more on psychosocial and relational effects of segregation. Also another presentation more on the sort of demographic and spatial effects linked to wider political economies and also changes within the global economy as well. So thank you, and Andreas, this very applied policy tool that sort of opens up new avenues as well for thinking about mechanisms to increase affordable housing in cities. So thank you very much for your presentations, and thank you also to the audience, and thank you for your questions as well, and the debate was very stimulating. Okay. Oh.